My name is Lauren Shulman. I use her and hers pronouns. I'm a confidential victim advocate in the Women and Gender Advocacy Center. So we are talking about supporting survivors in a work setting. Are we all recording? Okay, so let me say out loud for everybody who is present in the space that we were asked to record in this session. And there will be a point towards the end when we shift into a little bit more conversation that I plan to stop the recording because I think these conversations can be challenging and I don't want folks to feel like we can't have that conversation. So I want folks to be aware of that also so that everyone can be aware of asking questions or posing predicaments or whatever that may be. Okay, so a little bit, we always like to start with agreement and intentions. Just checking if that can be seen. So the first is we're talking about interpersonal violence in this conversation. I will go pretty high level, probably things that folks are like, yes, 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 got it. So hopefully some things that are new information and then much more applicable, like what do we do with this information in my particular role here on campus in the Student Center. I will, whenever I can, whenever I'm sharing examples, I'll speak with the I statements and invite others to kind of share that. Part of that is also that we don't necessarily want to bring the specifics of somebody else's story into this space, right? We want to honor the confidentiality of other people whose stories we might know. So want to offer that. When we're talking about interpersonal violence, we try to avoid generalizations. This is tricky and I will probably goof it up. But we try not to say, here's what we know is always true, or here's what's never true, because interpersonal violence is a societal, social issue that has many, many complexities to it, and I can't say anything that's absolute about it. So I mentioned the confidentiality piece, and this is really important. I shared at the beginning that I'm a confidential advocate. What that means for me and for other confidential advocates in our office is that we are under state statute required to maintain the confidentiality of folks that we are connected with. So this is separate from CFU, it's separate from our office, it's at a state level that we're obligated to confidentiality. I do want to share a little bit about what that means so that folks are aware in this room in case we're talking about examples. My confidentiality ends if I learn that somebody has a plan to hurt themselves or somebody else. If I learn that someone under the age of 18 is being abused, or if I learn that someone who harmed a minor remains in a position of power over minors. Those are things we talk about when we're meeting with students, but I think they're also relevant in this space in case folks are bringing an example. And then we'll ask that you also maintain confidentiality, but certainly I think the conversation is most rich when others are kind of engaging with lived experiences as feels appropriate, but also ask that we don't necessarily take those stories out into the world. Do take care of yourself. Something that we know and that we always know is true is there are, statistically speaking, pretty much always survivors in a room. There are probably people who have had experiences of interpersonal violence who are here today. So whether that is you or not, I would invite you to please take care of yourself in whatever way that means. If that means you need to step out at some point, if it means that you need to not come back after stepping out, please do the things that are right for you. I will carry that personally. And if you need support, I'm glad to check in afterwards. Please ask questions. This is much more engaging than like me just song and dance at the front of the room if folks have questions and ponderings and thoughts. And then we always want to share a little bit about gendered language. So interpersonal violence is considered a gender-based violence in part because who is most likely to enact violence, not experience violence, but enact violence is cisgender men. Okay, so in that way, it's gendered what we're talking about. But people of all gender identities, all races, all sexualities, disability statuses, immigration statuses are experiencing interpersonal violence. So we try to keep our language broad and not gendered. And if I do gender, please know that those are some of the frameworks that I'm kind of functioning from. We try to use victim and survivor a little bit interchangeably. Victim is a word that's used in the legal system. So if I was talking about reporting to police, for example, I would probably more likely be talking about a victim. If I'm talking about a student that I work with, I probably am referring to a survivor. We use those as the same, they mean the same thing, but I want you to know that there is a difference. And then I mentioned the content warning, right? We're talking about interpersonal violence. Please do what you need to do to take care of yourself. Is there anything that anybody would add, wants to share, or is important for you all in this space? Okay. These can always be added, and if there's something that comes up with. So we're going to jump right into the deep end and talk a little bit about sexual assault and talk about rape. It's really important at the beginning of this and any conversation that we are all on the same page about what it is that we're talking about when we say interpersonal violence. So there's many different kind of arms or branches that fall within interpersonal violence that we raise, and sexual assault and rape would be two of those experiences. So sexual assault and rape often get talked about as the same thing, right? Sexual assault, rape, doesn't make a difference between the two. It actually is really important, specifically from a legal term or a legal level, that we understand the difference between them. So sexual assault is more of an umbrella term that captures a lot of different behaviors. What we have on the board is, so any sexual contact without consent and may include touching of intimate body parts, intercourse, or penetration. So this includes things like groping or fondling. This can include like ass slaps, right? Like all kinds of unwanted body touching that happens. This also includes unwanted kissing. All of that falls under an umbrella of sexual assault. Often sexual assault is then confused with rape, which is a very specific type of sexual assault. So what we have as a definition is any completed or attempted unwanted vaginal, oral, or anal penetration by a penis, by fingers, by objects, through the use of physical force, such as being held down or threats to physically harm. We differentiate between these, and we think it's important for folks to understand. One is that sexual assault, I think, is much broader than we societally talk about it, right? So if somebody is like, I went on a date and the person that I went with kissed me and I didn't like that, that falls in the category, right? I didn't want that to happen. That falls in the category of sexual assault. But somebody might be like, oh, it's like kind of a minor nuisance, right? We have this like hierarchy of what is harm. But for somebody, that could be deep and severe and significant harm. Rape, we have a whole different kind of societal vision about, and it's often like it's the stranger in the bushes. It's extremely violent. There's blood, or there's something really horrible about it. And that's not necessarily factual either. So it's important to have this kind of foundation. We talked a little at the very beginning about like gendered language, and important to know that both sexual assault and rape can happen to anybody of any gender identity, with any body parts. This isn't like a one-way kind of experience, but it is often talked about that way. Are there questions about this? So a little bit of true or false. You are welcome to just kind of share out. We'll talk about the correct answers. So most victims of sexual assault know their perpetrator. Is this true or false? True. Yep. The statistic is that 95% know their perpetrator on a college campus. And we're thinking about the students here at CSU, 95% who experience harm know the perpetrator. And that's 80% nationally. So when we zoom out from a college campus, it's a little bit different. So keeping in mind, perpetrators are people in our lives, trusted friends, trusted partners, acquaintances, somebody we work with, right? That is who we're seeing. Okay, about 30% of sexual assault reports are false. False. About 98% are true. And even the ones that are false, there's very often an experience of trauma, but may not be something that would rise to a level that could be reportable, or somebody has exaggerated details because they can't talk about the specific thing that happened. There's absolutely a social narrative out in the world about false reports. They're very, very, very rare. Men and women commit sexual assault at similar rates. So that one's false also, yeah. So most perpetrators are men, so cisgender men in particular, and that is regardless of the gender of the victim. Okay. About 98% of the perpetrators in the college environment are men. So when we talk about this being a gendered crime, we are not trying to be enraged feminists or something like this is statistically what we see. is that it's most often cisgender men who are committing violence. And it's actually a very small portion of the population who are committing harm, and a much larger portion of the population who is not. That much smaller portion of the population is committing sexual violence on repeat, not just one time, but multiple times. So most victims of sexual assault are the same race as the perpetrator. What do we think? Is that true or false? Do we think false? Okay. So it's actually true, which is, we most often hear it as false, right? We also have a lot of social narratives about who is necessarily causing harm. There are two exceptions. So most often, sexual assault is happening by someone of the same race. It's a white person committing violence against a white person, right? The two exceptions are in Asian communities and in Native American communities. And in those two communities, it's most often white folks and specifically white men who are causing violence. And we could have a whole separate presentation about some of the research and the data and the reasoning behind that. But when we think of the history of the United States, of how violence has been enacted and about how sexual violence in particular has been used as a source of colonization, then some of the data around that can track from a historical level. Most survivors report the crime immediately. What do you think? False. False. Yeah, many never report at all. So I'm going to read a couple of statistics here. So 1 in 10 sexual assaults get reported to police. 1 in 10. Of those 1 in 10, 1 in 12 get accepted by the district attorney. Of those, 1 in 8 go to trial. And of those, 1 in 5 are found guilty. So you can see how that number shrinks and shrinks and shrinks and shrinks to it's 1 to 2% of reports, right, that actually go to law enforcement, come back as a guilty verdict. There are many reasons for that. Our criminal justice system is really complicated. It's has a very high burden of proof. So people have to have a lot of evidence to demonstrate that something happened. Sexual assault is often a crime that occurs without witnesses, where somebody may not be clear about what happened until the ability to get DNA evidence, for example, is even present. And so then it can end up being one person's word against another person's word, which we can imagine in a criminal legal system is really difficult to demonstrate. Of note, perpetrators, people who are found responsible, spend an average of 18 months in jail. So relatively not a long time. We could talk also in a whole separate session about if incarceration is the route to help people who have caused harm, but I think relevant to know. Anyway. The Women and Gender Advocacy Center, WGAC, sees an average of 7 new survivors a week. What do we think? True or false? True. Yeah. So that is pretty on par, especially during the academic year, between our 24/7 hotline, between our offices. We're seeing about 7 new folks per week who have not necessarily engaged in services. And keep in mind that our office works very specifically with folks who are affiliated with CSU. We're student fee funded, so it's most often students, but we do occasionally work in the very short term with staff and faculty who've also been impacted. So we share all of that to really frame, right? This is, again, not an issue out into the distance. It's something very present on our campus here. Worth noting that the highest risk for women of experiencing sexual violence is between their sophomore year of high school, their sophomore year of college. For male assaults, male survivors of sexual assault, most often that happens before the age of 14. So it happens very young, typically. And then for trans folks, so 1 in 2 trans folks is a huge statistic. And this one is really tricky to track because data reporting forms don't often ask someone's gender identity in an expansive enough way that somebody might be able to identify, I've experienced violence and I identify as trans. It's also very unsafe to potentially identify as trans and a survivor, right? Because you don't know how that is going to be received. There's a lot of stigma and stereotype about what it means to experience violence. So this is the best that we know. So I think it's important to know in general with these numbers that this is the best we can do. Sexual assault, for example, is extremely underreported. The number of folks that we talk to who never report to the university or to police is very, very high. So we know these numbers are probably low. So intimate partner violence and stalking. So we talk about IPV, I want to make mention, so up here we talk about intimate partner violence. Sometimes this is also interpersonal violence, and probably more colloquially, people hear about domestic violence. These all get kind of grouped together, but are not necessarily the exact same thing. Domestic violence doesn't often hit for college students, that doesn't land, right? For college students who may not be living with a partner or who are not married or like long-term partners. So domestic violence can feel like a very particular type of violence that doesn't always apply. Intimate partner violence, we talk about as happening between intimate partners. So it could be someone that a student is in a dating relationship with, but it could also be somebody that is like a regular hookup, right? That there's not an established relationship with. It could be somebody that they have worked with over a long stretch of time, and it becomes an intimately violent relationship. Worth noting that interpersonal violence, I often view as a little bit more expansive. So when we think of, for example, folks with disabilities, disabled folks, interpersonal violence can happen at the hands of caregivers, people that are trusted to support somebody in their day-to-day. The rates are really, really high. There may not be an intimate relationship there, but there is an interpersonal relationship there. So just want to kind of nuance that a little bit. So when we talk about dating or domestic or relationship violence, we're talking about abuse that is enacted by a current or former intimate partner, somebody that somebody is in an intimate relationship with in whatever way that they define that, right? There's lots of ways that somebody might talk about that. When we're seeing this kind of abuse, it could be physical, which is of course what we see most often in like media or what we hear about on college campuses. How we see that play out is very often emotional, psychological, manipulation, gaslighting, things like that, and then the sexual abuse. We also see financial abuse, stalking, and academic abuse in the form of things like picking a fight with a partner the night before they have a really big test, so that when they wake up in the morning, they have a difficult time showing up, right, for the test and really like engaging in that. And stalking, so there's a very literal meaning of stalking, which is to pursue prey or quarry. This happens in person, right? Following a person, maybe notes on a person's car, something like that. Very often it happens electronically. We see all the time on Snapchat, all kinds of things. There are like community, I don't understand Snapchat, I stay very far away from it, but there can be like community pages, right? Where students are all going in to connect with the class of 2026, right? And people are experiencing stalking as a result of that shifts from electronic stalking to in-person stalking. Electronic stalking can be really scary because you may not necessarily know who the perpetrator is, but they have a ton of information about you. It can be really intimidating, can keep people feeling really immobilized and that they need to stay off campus. One of my colleagues also talks about how college campuses are built for stalking, right? People have a fairly predictable schedule. Here's my Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Here's my Tuesday, Thursday class schedule. Here's when I go to the student center to get coffee. Here's when I go to my work or my job on campus, my extracurricular activities. All of that predictability can be really simple for someone who wants to stalk somebody, right? To kind of keep tabs on them, to know where they're at, to run into them on a regular basis on campus. So these are for sure things that we are seeing as well. We have just a little bit, I think gaslighting kind of became more part of like the common vernacular in the last few years. It's based on a movie from a long time ago where the premise is that a male partner is slowly dimming the lights, the gas lights in their home. And then every time the woman, the partner, is saying like, are the lights dimmer than they were before? He's like, no, you're losing it. They're not dimmer, but he is purposefully lowering the lights so that she feels disoriented and confused. So gaslighting, that's kind of where that phrase comes from. So we see this all the time, again, that somebody is saying something like, you're really being emotional, you really blew that out of proportion. It's not as bad as you thought that it was, right? So this like diminishing of somebody else's experience, denying them to the point that they don't believe their own experience. And as you can imagine, for somebody who is experiencing this on repeat day in and day out, it becomes really difficult then to identify, am I experiencing violence, or like, was I being totally unreasonable in that situation? This can be really complex, like a really complex form of psychological abuse for somebody to try and figure out how to navigate, because they first have to come to a point where they are like, this doesn't make any sense. You know, I always thought the lights were bright and now they seem really dim, but I'm being told that's not true. So this can be really confusing and can be difficult for somebody to come forward. It's often referred to as like crazy looking. That somebody just feels like, I'm just like really disconnected from reality, but I don't know why. So no more true or false. So most relationship violence includes physical abuse. What do we think? False. False. Yeah. We see emotional, psychological abuse all the time. Physical is, of course, what we see again in media, but it's not necessarily the most common thing. Grooming is a part of an abusive relationship. Do folks know what grooming is or have an idea? It's kind of this concept of like, so it's kind of like training a person in their behavior, right? So it's like being really kind to them. Maybe you go and you run some errands for them, you're building trust. Then you help them fix their car and you offer to pay also for that expense. And then you start holding some of those things over their head, like, actually, I did pay for your oil change, so I am going to need you to come over tonight, right? And I do expect that now you're going to stay in my home, right? So it starts off and it can be really confusing for victims or survivors. They feel like someone is being really thoughtful and kind to them, and then that behavior is turned on them. Grooming is very commonly part of abusive relationships, so that is true. And we see that very commonly on college campuses and very commonly when we have power dynamics. So when there's staff and faculty who are perpetrating harm against students, grooming is often part of that. Men and women commit relationship violence at similar rates. So this is, that is a fact. That first part is a fact. So what do we think about stalking? More often than the first part of the statement, men and women commit relationship violence is similar, is true, but it needs to be nuanced. When men are committing relationship violence, it's more often physical and sexual. When women are committing relationship violence, it's more often psychological and emotional manipulation, things like that. Domestic violence perpetrators are rarely arrested in Colorado. What do you think? Does that seem true or false? A little bit hard to say. It leans towards true that, let me make sure I'm not making about that. I'm going to say, so it's false, right? That they are arrested, but what's complicated about domestic violence and arrests is that we are considered a mandatory arrest state. So what that means is if law enforcement is called where they believe that, where they're told that there is domestic violence occurring, they have an obligation to arrest somebody in that situation. Often, the person who's arrested is not necessarily the person who's actually enacting the violence. It could be that they were trying to protect themselves in the moment and that appeared as violence. So somebody who regularly enacts violence might be able to kind of flip on and flip off their ability to engage in manipulative behavior. And as soon as law enforcement shows up, have like a very clean cut kind of demeanor that's like, I can tell you exactly what happened, officer. I can tell you exactly how this happened and what harm this person caused to me. And the person who's been experiencing violence might have a very difficult time trying to explain what happened because they're in kind of a trauma response. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. All right. this one. So we're going to talk about the 4 R's of trauma-informed care. But first, I want to check in about questions, thoughts, comments. I know we went, like I said, kind of straight into the deep end, straight into information that is hard to hear. So I want to check it. Any kinds of questions or thoughts? We're going to shift gears a little bit. We're going to turn away from what is it that we're talking about and a little bit more of within your various roles, what might it look like to be supporting people? So that's a little bit of this piece. So the 4 R's of trauma-informed care. This is a broad framework out in the world that informs how we can support people who've experienced trauma. I'll say that there is some conversation about trauma-informed as maybe like, is this too medical? Is this too much of a model? I think this is helpful in a setting like this for us to kind of ground ourselves and how can we be really supportive to the folks around us. I don't want to claim that this is like the perfect end all be all model of supporting people who've experienced trauma, but I think it can be a good place to start. So the 4 R's, the first one is to realize the wide impact and the frequency of trauma. A lot of that is the stuff that we talked about. We know that interpersonal violence, for example, happens very commonly on a college campus. We know that very often we're engaging with people who have had an experience of trauma. And I shared a little bit yesterday, but we also know that trauma is not just caused by interpersonal violence. It's caused by, frankly, by existence in this world that we're living in, right? It could be a car accident. It could be medical issues. It could be racial trauma, identity-based trauma, trauma for trans folks, right? These microaggressions or overt acts of discrimination that cause harm to somebody. So we have to recognize that trauma is out in the world and we're interacting with people who experience it. We need to recognize the signs and symptoms, and we're going to come to some of those pieces. But what's really important is that trauma is, I've seen it referred to as like kind of a pop psychology experience, where if you go on social media, people are like, this, my homework or my class, right, whatever, something was very traumatizing, but they may not actually be talking about trauma. They may be talking about an experience they didn't really like, about something that was uncomfortable, about something that they did not enjoy or that made them feel some kind of way. But trauma is a very particular experience related to our nervous system. So we'll talk more about that. A goal is to avoid re-traumatizing. And I think that that comes after these first two, that once we know what trauma looks like, once we know what leads to somebody experiencing trauma, then we can take steps to try to avoid causing more harm. And then responding with empathy and care. And this can be as simple as, I believe you, or I care about you. It matters to me how you're doing today. The responding with empathy and care does not need to be anything huge or outside of the scope of whatever your role is with somebody. Sometimes it can just be an act of humanity. So some of the things that we'll talk about will kind of circle back to these 4 R's. So the impact of trauma, something that we talk about very often is how trauma actually affects our bodies and our brains. So somebody experiences a traumatic event in their life, and maybe it was physical, maybe it was psychological, maybe it was mental, emotional, whatever that might be. All of those sound like really different kinds of experiences of trauma. How our body interprets them and how our brain interprets them is very, very similar, no matter the type of trauma. So we have kind of 2 different sides to our nervous systems in our bodies. We have the parasympathetic part of our nervous system, which is the part that helps us take a load off a little bit, right? It's the part that helps us relax. It's the part that helps us wind down at the end of the day. And then we have the sympathetic nervous system, which is our more, they call it the reptilian brain. So it's like the older part of our brain. It's less evolved. And it responds to internal and external stimuli really, really quickly, right? It sees what's happening around us and it comes up with a response. And so when we are thinking about trauma, we talk about fight, flight, and freeze most commonly. And those are the things that when a sympathetic nervous system is experiencing stimuli that says there is danger in our immediate vicinity, we need to do something about it. These are the ways that our body responds. So it's going to respond with a fight, flight, or freeze response. The fight being, I am staying here and I'm gonna fight you until I get out of whatever the situation is. The flight response is I'm running, right? I'm leaving the situation in whatever way I can. And the freeze response is our body's way of saying, I have no other way to keep myself safe. So I'm gonna stay here and see if I can mitigate harm, right? If we think of animals who are being preyed upon, that they might freeze to make themselves invisible, right? They might shrink into themselves to try and kind of disappear. And so these are like very, very ancient parts, evolutionarily old parts of our bodies that are informing how we respond to a stimulus. These are not choices. Nobody gets to decide, like, in this moment I will fight and in this moment I will freeze. We don't have a choice in that matter. It's really just what our body and our brain, how it responds to a situation. For somebody who then experiences trauma, what it often means is that they have gotten stuck. Their nervous system has gotten stuck in a particular response. So often what we see is that students are, somebody who experienced trauma has kind of like a pendulum, right? These two different sides of how they show up. So maybe they experienced trauma and they had kind of a fight response to that. So maybe they're really agitated. They are moving quickly. They are showing up in their like really hyperactive. They're really hypervigilant. Maybe they're stuck in kind of a freeze response. And so maybe they're moving really slowly, or they're having a very difficult time engaging in the workplace or in their academics. They're not able to engage in the way that they typically would. So those are things that we see. The flight can also show up as kind of a hypervigilance or as just an escaping, right? This might be that somebody doesn't make it to their shifts as often anymore. It could be that they're maybe a little bit less engaged in meetings because their brain is kind of somewhere else. Again, these are not choices. Somebody is not saying I am checking out of the content. They're saying that I need to keep myself safe right now because their body never left the trauma response they were in. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the amygdala and the hippocampus. And so these are the different parts of our bodies. The amygdala is, again, that kind of reptilian portion of our brain. This is where emotions get stuck. It's where they are developed, and also then in trauma where the emotions get stuck. And that is often a part of a trauma response. If somebody is kind of living and reliving within the emotions and the experiences of a traumatic experience. The hippocampus is more prefrontal cortex, so it's a little bit more evolved version of our brains, where like logic and reason and thoughts and memories comes into play. So trauma can kind of get stuck in our amygdala and hasn't necessarily processed all the way through to our hippocampus, where we can make sense of it, or where we can say, I'm looking at my surroundings and I'm determining that I'm in a safe place right now. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about how trauma shows up. We mentioned that it's often unreported. Very often people do not recall the things that happen. The way that our memories store trauma, sometimes it can be backwards, sometimes it can be missing key pieces of the experience. It can show up in ways that we might not necessarily logically expect because of the way that it shows up in our reptilian brain. People might experience confusion. I'm not clear what happened, or I don't know what I said beforehand. The hypervigilance and the fear, this is being really hyper aware about what's happening around them. This is paying really close attention to what other people are doing, or having big responses to when somebody gives like a small piece of feedback, like having a much bigger response to what that would be than what we might expect. Talking about avoidance. So maybe not showing up, right? They're not coming to work. They're not wanting to tell you about what happened. They maybe just start being, you might read it as a kind of flaky or disconnected. Having difficulty with other relationships. Oftentimes trauma occurs, as we know, in relationships where there was already, established trust, something like that. And so having experienced trauma can mean that they lose trust in the people around them. And that can kind of seep out. So maybe I've lost trust with a particular person that caused harm, but now I'm having a difficult time trusting the other people in my life because I don't know that somebody who I trust isn't going to again cause me harm. Very often we hear self-blame. So this is where survivors say, like, I should have done something different. I should have left the situation. I should have set a more firm boundary. I should have. And what we remind students or survivors is that the only person who could have stopped harm from happening is the person who caused harm, right? We could like should ourselves into forever about what we could have done in a situation, but that doesn't resolve that somebody else decided to take action and did that. The changes in habits are really prevalent, and we hear this very often. I'll say most often where I hear this is in sleeping and eating habits, that students tell me I can't stop eating, or I'm really not eating at all. I'm having a very difficult time getting back to eating 3 meals a day, and or packing my lunches or whatever that thing is. And then also hearing from students that they're experiencing either no sleep, which could be a result of having nightmares, right? Waking up in the middle of the night with intrusive memories or flashbacks or being triggered by something, or that they're just sleeping nonstop. The only thing they feel like they can do is sleep. Academic challenges, we often see that folks' grades will just suddenly kind of drop off. And one of the things that our office can do and that our advocates do is write letters of support for students to their faculty or staff members to say, we don't share anything, but we will share if they had something significant happen, they're not able to engage in exactly the way that they want to. We appreciate any flexibility you are willing to offer. Instructors don't have to honor that. They very often do. But I think what can be really difficult is academic challenges don't necessarily happen immediately, right? If something happens over the weekend, a student might be like, that was bad, but I am busy with schoolwork and I'm not going to cope with this right now. So for 3 weeks, maybe they show up and they do the things and they make it through midterms, whatever that is. And then maybe they go to spring break and they have just a couple days to like sit with the things that have happened. And suddenly after spring break, things drop off. This can be really frustrating for supervisors and for staff and faculty. Like, what do you mean? Like something happened a while ago, but all of a sudden you're having a difficult time being engaged. It can take a long time for things to settle in for folks. And so this is something we see really commonly is that students are having a difficult time focusing, staying engaged, showing up, absorbing. Maybe they're going to their classes, but they're finding that taking notes are pointless and they read what they've written and they don't mean anything. They can't make sense of the content. Very common. Unhealthy coping, I'm guessing probably all of us have dabbled in our own unhealthy coping mechanisms at various times in our lives. We see this all the time, right? Often substance use and specifically alcohol. The students are maybe drinking much more often than they used to. It could be things like exercising a lot, way more than they typically do. It could be spending all of their time with friends, which in itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. But if they're not seeking other ways to cope and to manage the things that they're feeling, then that could become kind of an unhealthy reliance on people in their lives. And then a loss of sense of self happens all the time for folks who've experienced trauma, that they thought they knew who they were, right? And then this experience, especially when we consider societal stigma, the way that interpersonal violence gets talked about, how scary it can be to have to talk to somebody about this, the isolation, the loneliness, all of those things can kind of detach people from their group of friends, from their family, from hobbies, from their academics, from their job, which can really cause a significant loss for people, feeling like they really don't know who they are anymore as a result of this kind of ripple effect of things. What are other things folks are aware of as like a sign of trauma, or what do you wonder about might be a sign?
The dissociation, or
yeah. So dissociation, thinking of like, this is a very specific experience where people have kind of an out-of-body experience, right? Often survivors describe dissociation as like I was floating above my body and I was watching what was happening. So that can happen in the moment when trauma is occurring, but it can also happen after the fact. It makes logical sense from kind of a protective mechanism standpoint that there are times when our brain is like, this is too much. I'm going to leave the situation because I can't physically escape from it. But it can be terrible when you're in classes and you're dissociating, or you have to watch a film or something and you can't pay attention to it. It can be really, really difficult. I think you also mentioned fawning, is that right? Yeah. Yeah, and so fawning is another fight, flight, freeze, and then a fawn response. There's interesting conversations in the world about like, is this a nervous system response or is it a learned response? But ultimately, fawning is where people will, like someone, a victim or survivor, will appease the person in their life who has caused them harm to mitigate or lessen the likelihood of further harm. So where we often see fawning is with children who experience violence, that they can't leave the situation, right? It's a parent or a caregiver or something like that. And so they will just do what they need to do to appease so that the harm doesn't happen. Thank you. Other pieces, yeah.
I was going to say, I'm really also development of phobias or bad memories.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So sudden fears related to specific things. Yeah, absolutely. We'll talk about those as like triggers, like you said. So I'm thinking about students that I've met with who violence happened at a very particular part of campus and then can't come to that place on campus, right, without being triggered and having their whole day messed up. And not uncommon, as you might guess, that is the student center for a lot of people because it's such a center of campus. And because there's so many people here that violence can be enacted without somebody necessarily noticing what's going on. So those triggers are very real for anyone who's experienced violence, and especially on a college campus. Yeah. Other thoughts? Coming up, person?
Well, like I want to support what you said. You really want lack of trust in maybe that person or that particular gender.
Yeah. Yeah. So having like trust issues, and especially like when we kind of combine that with triggers, we'll hear from folks that like, I saw somebody who wasn't the perpetrator, but their hair was exactly the same. And it set me off all day long, right? I couldn't show up to my job. I couldn't do the thing. So something like that, that kind of trigger can be really difficult. And then the trust piece, for sure, that the person who caused harm was somebody that I deeply trusted. So now all these other people that I trust in my life, now I'm wondering if I can actually trust them. And this are within our office, we kind of talk about this idea of like gaslighting ourselves, where we are now like, I don't know if I can trust anything that I have thought before, because I thought I could trust that person. They caused me harm. Now everybody else in my life, I don't know. I'm not sure I should trust them. It can be really disorienting, solutioning. Yeah. Anything else that folks are thinking about doing?
Playing in the situation.
Totally. Yeah. Often students are like, you know what, I had something bad happen over the weekend, but it's fine. I just need to, I'm just focusing on it, or like it wasn't that big of a deal, or I've got all the support I need. We often talk to students who come back around 6 months later and suddenly their grades have tanked, right? They have this immaculate GPA perhaps, and then suddenly their grades have tanked and they're having a hard time figuring out why. Often trauma is one of those things because maybe in the moment they were like, we're good. I hated that that happened. But then after some time, then maybe it can like hit and happen the realization. Yeah. Okay. So we want to talk about the best way to support survivors. We try and have a simple model to remember. So the first part is believing them, right? If somebody came to you, they don't have to share anything with you. If they say something bad happened to me this weekend, I'm going to have a really difficult time coming to my shift. We in our roles don't need to investigate that. We never like, so what happened, right? Let me decide if it was bad. We never need to ask questions about that. It can just simply be, thank you so much for trusting me. I believe you. I care about you, right? And that is something we often say, and that I would encourage you all to say if you're in a situation, because it's something that survivors don't always hear, is just simply, I believe you, right? They're out in the world trying to prove a thing happened that there's no evidence of, and there were no witnesses, and they're confused, and they can't even remember exactly what happened, but they know that they woke up the next day and they felt really shitty, and they don't know why, right? So to have somebody in their life say, I believe you, and I care about you, can be really, really impactful in the moment for them in managing that and in their healing long-term, to have somebody who believes them. Part of our role is to empower people. Sometimes that can look like validating and affirming. It sounds like you've had a really tough time, and I want to support you in this, right? I'm not questioning, I'm not doubting you, I'm not wondering, I'm just validating that you are struggling right now. This is a tough time for you. And then supporting can look a million different ways. So between empowering and supporting, one of our roles, so if we're thinking from like a supervisory lens, might be to get somebody to an appropriate resource. That could be us. It could be a trusted friend. It could be potentially it's you, right? Whatever that might mean, but helping somebody find the support that they need to take the steps they need to take. We know from what we talked about, many people are not looking to report, right? So it's not necessarily like, let me get you to law enforcement. Often that could be a very unhelpful step for somebody for many, many reasons. But maybe it is like, let me get you to a confidential advocate, or let's think about what supports are like in your life. How can I help you access those things right now? And then here we have take care of yourself. I am guessing also that everyone in this room is a responsible employee. So the other piece of that is to tell someone, and specifically to share the information if you know that it's connected to interpersonal violence, or if you suspect, is to also let Title IX know. I don't know, I'm not going to make too many assumptions about how people do or don't feel about being a responsible employee, but something that we know is having information shared with Title IX gets students connected to resources like ours and the counseling center and to student case management really, really quickly and efficiently. Because when something goes to Title IX outreaches and says, we learned something happened, here's a bunch of resources. If you want to report to our office, here's information about how to do that. It doesn't bind somebody into a reporting process that they don't want to be a part of. It doesn't obligate them to have to talk to somebody typically that they don't want to talk to. It really just gets them connected into resources. So I think sometimes that responsible employee role can feel complicated for supervisors who want to be trusted. We always encourage that folks are transparent about their role as a responsible employee right off the bat. If I learn about anything in this Title IX realm, I do have to share that information with the university. I steer clear in former roles. I have steered clear of calling it reporting, because reporting has like a million connotations with it and it sounds punitive and scary. So I had always talked about it as like, I need to share this information. I'm obligated to share this information with the institution because I want to make sure you get access to resources. So something to think about, and then to take care of yourself. It can be, even if you don't know anything about what happened to a person, but you know somebody who's on your team is really struggling as a result of something that happened, that can be really distressing. And maybe for you, that looks like, I'm going to just really stay in, and I'm going to stay a little bit late because I need to do a little bit of extra work. Or maybe that's like, whatever coping mechanism feels right for you. Maybe it's having a couple extra drinks or whatever the thing is. And I would encourage that we all are paying attention to those things. It's sometimes difficult to connect back, like, why am I feeling so amped up, to a student told me a really hard thing today. But you are better able to show up, right, for a student, to continually be supportive for them if you are able to kind of make that connection, even if you don't know for sure. Heard a hard thing today. I care about the person that it happened to. I want to, do something kind for myself tonight. What are questions or thoughts about this?
I have a question. Yeah. My question is, what if an employee comes to me as a supervisor and says, I want to tell you this in confidence. Please don't tell anything. Do I tell him or her to go ahead and share it, and then maybe introduce that to resources which he or she doesn't want? Or let her know from that point that I am under obligation to like escalate things to resources that can be helpful to you. So if you still want to go ahead and share it, go ahead. If not, what do you think?
Yeah, I love that question, because I think I'm guessing that's happened for a lot of people in some form. I love the kind of second way that you framed it, that is, let me pause you, right? Before I want you to be able to share with me, and I love that you trust me. I want to tell you a little bit about my obligation and my role, so you can make an informed choice, right? One of the things that we know for people who've experienced interpersonal violence is they've had choices taken away from them, right? When the violence occurred, They didn't get to make choices about what happened or about how somebody treated them. And so one small quote unquote thing that we can do in our support roles is give choice back. So in that moment, if somebody came to me and they said, I have something, I need you not to tell anybody about it, I would say, thank you so much for trusting me. That means a lot to me. I don't know what you're about to share, but I want to remind you that I'm a responsible employee. So if I learn about things related to interpersonal violence, gender-based violence, I'm obligated in my role to share that with the institution. You are still welcome to share that with me, but I want you to know that anything you tell me, I have to then share with Title IX, and they will then have that information. If you want to tell somebody about the experience and I am not the person, let me connect you with confidential resources so you can talk to somebody about it. I don't know. How does that sound or how does that feel?
Sounds great, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, please.
So from my understanding, like pro-stop, like with pro-stop, does that not require a pro-stop?
Right.
Yeah. It's strictly just students stop.
Yeah.
Or students.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah, and the meaning behind it is that Title IX needs to take action, right, on anything that happens that violates someone's Title IX rights, which is specifically right to education, which is where it lands for students, right? And Title IX is like an office of 7 people or something like that, so they can't possibly know all the things happening out in the world. So that's why they have delegated that responsibility to responsible employees across campus who then are expected to submit information to them. For if you are learning about staff member situations, know that especially if it's happening on campus or within the context of a job, OEO, there are like Title VII, for example, is discrimination, federal discrimination law, and so OEO can potentially hold people accountable in that realm.
So I really struggle, and I don't know if I'm still recording.
Yes. Do you want to hang on to your question? I have like 2 more slides. Love that. Okay. Okay, so just a little bit about self-care. I think it's really important. I talked about it a little bit on the last slide. I think it has to be really important to me because I would stop showing up for my job every day if I didn't, because we're not talking about casual things. But I think it's really important for all of you in your roles, whatever they are, to think about how self-care looks, and especially so that you can proactively think about self-care in advance of trying to help somebody. I'm guessing all of us have heard like the airplane example, right? That you need to put on your own oxygen mask before you put on the oxygen mask of the person next to you. Self-care is really important. And self-care has been commodified and it's like bubble baths and fancy things. And sometimes self-care is like, I am prepping my lunch for tomorrow so that I know what I'm eating for the day. Like I'm making sure I carry a water bottle with me so I probably stay somewhat mildly hydrated, right? So sometimes it's just these foundational things. I'm going for a walk during lunch to make sure I get some fresh air, or I talk to other people. And would encourage, if you haven't dedicated time and energy, to think just a little bit about that for yourself, because it serves you first and foremost, and most importantly, it serves anybody that you are working with, right? Or who is in your life in any form. Okay. We always like to show or teach, I guess, like a quick kind of self-care strategy. So we talked a lot about the nervous system. We talked about how it functions. And one of the things that is a great benefit is deep breathing. Deep breathing is talked about all the time. And I will say, for a while, whenever someone was like, take a deep breath, I was like, get out of here. That's not helpful. It doesn't do anything. But it has physiological benefits. So it hits our vagus nerve when we take really deep diaphragmatic breaths where our belly extends outward. It's our vagus nerve, and our vagus nerve goes straight up into our brain, and it sends calming signals to our parasympathetic nervous system that say, we're safe, we're okay, everything's fine. So we'll do this one, which is called box breathing. So as you're ready, so you'll see it's breathing in for 4 seconds, holding for 4 seconds, breathing out for 4 seconds, and holding for 4 seconds. can be a really, really quick reset for your nervous system. If you have a terrible conversation, maybe it's related to interpersonal violence, maybe it's not. Take a quick box breath. To remind yourself that you're okay. Check in with your surroundings. Those are things that you can do. Okay.
Also add something.
Yeah, please.
Just because breathing brings anxiety for me. Yeah. Because I'm like, other than breathing. So swallowing, that also brings up does the same thing as my lateral tapping. So doing walking.
I love that. Yes, thank you for saying that. Yes, you're right. Sometimes holding breath can be really stressful for people. Butterfly taps are another way to kind of get our body to take it down a couple notches. We also talk with survivors about grounding exercises, which can feel really simple, but can be really impactful. So a very simple grounding exercise is naming 5 things I can see. And that's like, I see the owl, I see the computer, I see the water bottle, I see the people, I see the people, right? Whatever the things are. 4 things that I can feel with my hands, with my feet, with my body. 3 things that I can hear, 2 things I can smell, 1 thing I can taste. That a simple grounding exercise like that can bring somebody back into the present moment. So when we're talking about things like dissociation or experiencing triggers or intrusive memories, those simple kind of grounding exercises are things that we offer to folks to kind of come back to the present and kind of bring themselves back. Okay, from here, we'll pause and we can pause the recording if we didn't.